I'm excited to do this. I really liked Riley's presentation, I guess, last month about the Maple audit. So I thought it might be fun to do something similar with Astaria. And like I said, I found it really interesting and useful to get a little context on the system and have someone who worked on it there to ask questions to, rather than just like reading an audit report. So hoping we can do something similar. I'll give kind of a high level overview of what Astaria is, how it works, some of the things that are interesting or different in the system. And then I'm going to run through a few of our favorite findings from the audit, and we can chat about those. So first, just kind of high level audit results. Team was Sama, Noah, BlockDev, and I. We spent 3 weeks on it, found 183 issues, 6 of which were critical, 24 highs. So there's lots of juicy stuff to work with. And so there's a quick overview of the system. So at a super high level, Astaria is a protocol where lenders can lend, I guess now any ERC20 at the time of the audit, WETH only, with NFTs as collateral. There's a few things that make it unique. So I'll walk through the different kind of players in the system. Strategist is the person who creates a vault being something that holds an ERC20 and takes NFTs in as collateral in order to make loans. The strategist can make a vault that is private, which means it's just their own money in there, or they can make a vault that's public, which is an ERC 4626 that anyone can invest in and kind of tag along with the loans that the strategist is making. An interesting way that they manage these strategies, because you can imagine there'd be a lot of expensive data on chain to do the lending back and forth. The strategist defines strategies in a predefined way. So which NFTs they would lend against, how much they would lend against them, all that kind of stuff. They organize all of those strategies that they're willing to do into one Merkle tree and then sign the root. And so what that allows is for a lender that they can do that totally gaslessly, and that a lender can then take that root, propose a loan they would like to take, prove it against one of those strategies, and then prove the strategies all the way up to that Merkle root in order to kind of keep a lot of that off chain and allow those loans to happen. So that's how vaults exist. From the borrower's perspective, one thing that's interesting is rather than giving the NFT into the vault as collateral, which would mean it could only be used once or only be used in that vault, you actually put the NFT into a collateral token contract, which gives back one NFT that represents that piece of collateral and is now integrated into the system. So you can use that same piece of collateral to take up to 5 loans, stacked in order of preference. So the first loan you take would get paid back first, and then the next, and then the next. A cool feature they have with that is flash action. So basically, if you're the owner of that piece of collateral, the ability to basically take your own NFT as a flash loan in order to claim an airdrop or get fees if it's a Uniswap LP position, that kind of thing. And then on the other side, the actual loans are represented by a separate token that they call the lien token. And so basically whoever holds that token is the owner of the debt and is who gets paid as the loan is paid off. And so those can get traded between vaults, they can get sold to individuals, and they've got this cool system where they can be bought out permissionlessly. So if any other vault wants to offer a better interest rate or a longer duration, they can just take over the loan, and all payments go to them at that point. So that gives users this understanding that whatever loan they take, they're probably going to get the best rate the market will allow as it's kind of bid down by other vaults. And then the last high level thing I want to explain is how liquidations work. So there's no oracle, there's no missed payments. Basically, you are responsible for paying the full loan amount plus interest by the end of the duration. So the longest duration they allow, I think at that time was 45 days. And if you pay nothing up to 44 days, it's fine. But as soon as you cross 45 days, if it's not fully paid off, it's able to be liquidated. And so at that point, anyone can send it to a Seaport auction. And we'll get into some of the interesting findings we had around that. But they send it to a Seaport auction. When it sells, that money is used in order to pay off the lenders. And if there's anything left over, that goes back to the collateral, so I guess the borrower. And we won't get into it too much, but there's this epoch system for payouts, basically ensuring that because we don't know the exact value of the vault, because there are loans outstanding that we don't know if they'll get paid or if they're liquidated, how much that will pay, they use this epoch system where if you want to withdraw, you essentially have to wait for all of those things to clear in order to get a definite final balance that you can withdraw it. So it's a lot of moving pieces. A quick overview of some of the things that made this really complex. They call back and forth between contracts a lot. So I've got this chart here that Noah made using UML that was really helpful for us, but you can see like just for one vault to buy out another vault, the calls are going back and forth between the router and back to the vault and to the lien token and back to the vault again, and then doing one commitment there and doing one commitment elsewhere. So there's a lot of this logic of calls jumping around between these contracts to validate different things. It's also almost entirely stateless. So all of the information around the loans is stored in the lien token contract, but it's not actually stored. The hash of all of the liens for a given piece of collateral is stored. And so when a user wants to take some action, they have to basically, as one of their arguments, pass the entire stack of loans for that piece of collateral. Then the system hashes that and makes sure it matches what's in the system, performs all the actions on it, and then saves the new hash at the end of all that process. The other thing that's kind of challenging with that is when you've got so much data to prove, like with the making sure that the strategies align with the Merkle root and all of that, so much of this data is submitted because it's stateless. So there's a lot of challenges around making sure that as each piece of data is used, it's actually validated. And the last really complicated piece is since it's an ERC 4626 and we're letting people buy in and out, we need the total assets of the vault to be really accurate, or else it can be abused. But that's always changing based on if loans are actually paid back or not paid back, if they're liquidated, what prices those are at. So there's a lot of complexity there to make sure that there's never a moment where that could be exploited. So I know it's a very, very fast overview, but I want to pause there. Any questions about the system and how it works before we get into the actual findings? Okay, if not, I will get into some of the findings that were most interesting. So the first one was, this was, I think, the first finding we found. There's a role in the system for a delegate. So what that means is if I'm creating a vault and I'm the strategist who's defining those strategies, I can have a separate address that is allowed to sign my Merkle root in order to allow my strategies to be valid. And you can see here that when a vault's created, that's passed into this init function. And as long as it's not set to address 0, that's saved as somebody who can sign. The challenge here is that if you don't assign it, then obviously it remains set to address 0. And if we look at a slightly edited version of the function that's validating that data, we can see they call EC recover directly. Then they check that it matches that strategist that was inputted into this function call. And then they make sure that either that matches the owner or that matches the delegate. And some of you may see already what the problem is here, that if you call EC recover with a phony signature, you're able to get it to return address 0. And if we look at these two validations, this strategist is one of the pieces of data that's input directly into the arguments. So again, this goes back to that same challenge of having a lot of this data inputted, is if they were pulling that strategist kind of from the vault storage, there wouldn't be this mismatch. But in this case, we're able to actually pass address 0 as the strategist, confirm that this recovered address 0 matches the delegate, and get basically any loan we want to take to pass. So the result is that any public vault that doesn't set their delegate, any malicious user can make up a strategy, which could essentially be lend all the vault's money for a fake NFT, provide a root that's signed by address 0, and then that'll pass the check as the delegate and allow the vault to be drained of all its funds. So the fix there was pretty simple. They just needed to add this or statement that recovered is not allowed to be address 0. The next thing that I found really interesting, so this was the modifier that they used to basically enforce all of the validation that the stack was being used correctly. So the stack is for a given NFT, what are all the loans that are currently taken against it? And like I mentioned, what they're doing is saying, you, as the user calling the function, input the entire stack. We'll hash it and make sure that it matches the hash that's saved, and then we'll allow you to edit it and resave a new hash. The problem here, if we look at this stack function, is they're trying to account for the situation where there's a brand new piece of collateral with no loans taken against it. So in that case, the hash that's saved in the system is 0 because no one's done anything. And if we enforced that rule cleanly, the hash of the stack would not be 0, it would be the hash of 0. And so what they did is they kind of created this carve out of, if the hash is 0, then we bypass this validation. The problem is, if the hash is 0, we bypass the validation, which means we were allowed to add any stack we wanted. And so what that leads to is this situation where if somebody deposits a piece of collateral and it has no loans against it, any stack that I input will be accepted. And so I can immediately make a payment towards that piece of collateral with loans and input a stack that is filled with the fact that it owes me money, even though it doesn't. And because it will bypass that validation, it'll go through the payment, and the result will be that final stack will be saved at the end, and that will now be the canonical thing that is saved in storage, is that the stack hash is one in which they owe money that they didn't actually owe. So that was a pretty critical issue as well. And the fix there was just to add an extra check beforehand, right? That if the state hash is 0, we also need to be submitting a stack that has a length of 0. Otherwise we could manipulate it in this way. I'll pause for a second there. Any questions on those two issues before I move on? All right, moving along to some of the Seaport stuff. So the way that the system works is that when a piece of collateral is liquidated, which happens when any loan is not paid back by the end of that duration, they, instead of saving the hash of all the loans, they move those loans elsewhere, and they change that hash to just be the byte 32 of the string active auction. And that's used kind of as validation throughout the system to make sure that things are kind of locked down during that state, that we are not allowed to take more loans, that we're not allowed to make payments towards things, that everything is kind of locked at that point. The problem is that they added this additional external function where a collateral holder could list their own piece of collateral for sale on Seaport. And most of that, you can see they check here that it isn't already at auction when the owner is doing this, but they don't actually set that state anywhere in this function, because I guess it's done in the liquidation function and they missed that check there. So as a result, when someone sells their own collateral on Seaport through the system, they're still able to act on it within the Astaria system. And so as an example, a user could deposit a piece of collateral, immediately list it for auction, and then go take a bunch of loans against it. And when the Seaport auction closes, none of those loans will have been recorded in the system, and none of those people will get paid back. So this essentially gives a user a way to steal funds from any vault, as long as they have an NFT that vault is willing to loan against, even though the vault will never get paid back for it. So for this one, there were a few possible fixes, but they ended up deciding to just get rid of that list for sale on Seaport function, which solved the problem. And I want to just quickly, before going on to the next issues, I think there's some interesting lessons in some of these in terms of what went wrong. And so, like, if we look at this one, you could blame this on not using EC recover properly, right, and not having a check. But we can see that this fact that they got to input any arguments they wanted and had to validate all of those against state at separate times, that messiness is probably a lot of what allowed this to slip through. Similarly here, it was this like trying to facilitate this system where all the data is off chain and we're just comparing it against hashes, opened the door for this to be an issue. And then here's something that came up a lot, which is having many different entry points using shared backend logic, but where the division between that logic wasn't quite as clean as I think it needed to be. And so there were variables that were not set in one case that needed to be set in order to keep the logic consistent between those different entry points. Moving on to the next issue, this was an interesting one. So one of the features of these vaults is that they allow, or I guess of the loans, is that they allow the owner of the loan to set a different payee for a given loan. So whereas like a vault would be whoever owns the lien token, which is usually a vault, would be the default of who would get paid when the borrower made a payment towards a loan. They were able to set this payee role, and the I guess the lien token would check who that payee was, and if it was set, forward the payment to them rather than to the actual holder of the loan. What this complicates is, I mentioned before, there's this challenge where the ERC 4626 needs to calculate assets perfectly, or else things can get kind of messy. And that's the case here, right? So if we look at how this ERC 4626 is calculating the value of a vault at a given time, they're always tracking these two pieces of data. So the y-intercept is the total asset, including loans owed at the last checkpoint. So it would calculate, it would assume that it's going to get paid in full. And it would calculate that as of this second, the assets we have plus the amount of all those loans that is owed to us in interest up to this point totals this y-intercept. It would also always be calculating the slope value, which is the additional assets being earned per second for all of those outstanding loans. And you can see when they're calculating total assets to get the value of the public vault token, they're basically just taking the y-intercept, and then they're adding the slope times the number of seconds since the last time that the y-intercept was updated. And so this mostly works, right? The only major issue with that is that some loans won't get paid back, and so they've got this like withdrawal delay with epochs in order to account for that. The problem is that if you're using these values to set the value for the vault at all times, they really, really need to be accurate. Like anywhere that's off is a place that this could be exploited. And if we look at this set payee function, we can see that's never updating the y-intercept and slope anywhere in there. And so what happens is, if I'm a vault that holds a lien, I can set the payee to someone else, and my vault's value stays the same, which it shouldn't. And once it's set to someone else, if I go, for example, transfer that lien to a different owner, it's checking whether the payee is a public vault before making those accounting changes. And so what we end up with is this ability to kind of loop this cycle where I can set the payee to someone else, I can transfer the vault somewhere else and not diminish my y-intercept and slope, and then I can do the reverse back. And I'm able to kind of ratchet up the total assets of both of those vaults by doing this cycle. That doesn't allow me to take all the funds from a vault myself because of the way the withdrawal process works, because all the withdrawals are basically split evenly between the people who withdrew in a given epoch. But it does allow me to basically watch the epochs, watch for a time where there aren't many other people, do this process and withdraw myself, and end up splitting all the funds of the vault between me and whatever other strangers were lucky enough to withdraw at the same time as me. And the fix here, again, rather than trying to get all that accounting right, they just got rid of the ability to set payees. They kept it that the owner of the lien token is who gets paid always, which got rid of this issue entirely. While on payees, another interesting error is when you're transferring loans from one vault to another. We can see here that it does this check that it's not currently at Seaport being liquidated, and then it just calls the generic ERC 721 transfer from function. And nowhere in there is the update to make sure that the payee is reset. This was similar, I think there was an issue that was similar to this in the Art Gobbler's Code Arena contest, where when when some action was taken and assets were transferred, the approvals remain set to whoever they were set to before. This is a similar issue where if I'm the owner of a piece of collateral and I set the payee to myself, and then I sell it or transfer it to someone else, until they reset it, I'm still the payee. And so there's kind of a more general lesson here. Something that I always try to keep an eye on is like, if something is changing hands, making sure that all of those variables that are important and impact like future direction are reset to the status quo, rather than kind of lingering in this way where it could be abused by someone buying loans, setting themselves as payee, trading them off, and kind of keeping the interest payments for that narrow slice of time. There was also a bit of an interesting attack here that you could do this intentionally if you really architected it. So you could play both sides of this basically by being the vault and taking a loan from it, setting yourself as the payee, selling that loan, and then immediately back running that transaction to pay off the entire loan right away. And so you would be able to basically sell these loans that appeared to have value but actually would not have value. And the fix there, obviously, it's already taken care of if they get rid of that payee role. Okay, a few other ones that I found really interesting, and then we'll flip to questions. This was something BlockDev caught that I thought was really interesting. They implement a lot of Uniswap math that's pulled from Uniswap v2, and they kind of had those as a library outside of the rest of their code. But because it was using that old Uniswap math, and it was expecting that math wouldn't be checked, and so there was formulas like this one where it would be possible for the mul div to overflow and then adjust from there. That was the intended behavior, and so they were obviously written to work with the Solidity compiler before 0.8. Astaria was intended to work after it, and so they needed to wrap all of that in unchecked blocks. So I thought that was like a good catch, because it was something that if you looked at the code on its own kind of made sense, but knowing the context of how it was used originally was really important. So there's the change, just adding that block. And then the last one is one that Salman found. He was incredible and found a ton of really big things that were a little too complex to try to explain in a short time like this. And so this one was one that I think was really cool and it can click pretty quickly. So the way that these Seaport liquidations work is that when a piece of collateral is deposited, another contract is immediately deployed that is called the clearinghouse. And that is a contract specifically for that one token that, if it ever goes to auction, is set as the receiver for that auction. And you can see the logic here that all it does is that when ETH is received by this contract, it verifies that that's actually coming from Seaport. It converts it and turns it into ETH. And then it calls this pay debt via clearinghouse function, which goes back to the lien and goes through all of the lenders of that piece of collateral, pays them back in order, and pays the remainder back to the collateral holder. So this is seems like logic that makes a lot of sense. The problem is that the only check here is that it's coming from Seaport, not that it's actually coming from the correct auction. And so that means that any piece of collateral that goes to auction, I could arbitrarily sell anything else on Seaport and set this clearinghouse as the receiver of the funds. And as soon as it received any ETH, it would call this function, go through, pay off all the debt, and part of that paying off the debt is settling the auction and basically locking it so that no future payments can be made. So anything that went to liquidation could then be basically not paid back and locked so that none of the lenders got their money back. So I thought that was a really good catch. The fix is actually very interesting. They turned the clearinghouse into kind of a fake ERC 1155. And they set that 1155 as one of the consideration items on the auction. And so what happened was that they would that when the auction ended, it would first transfer the collateral to the buyer, and then it would try to transfer this ERC 1155. And it was that transfer function in the 1155 that would first check that the collateral had actually moved so that the auction was actually over, and then would execute all the rest of this logic. So I thought that was like an interesting way to tackle it, where the auction was closed not by funds being sent and just assuming it was right, but by forcing Seaport to call this transfer function that could initiate all the rest of the logic. Okay, those were some of the highlights of things that I thought were interesting in the project, but would love to chat more, answer questions, whatever is useful to everyone else here.
Hi there, Zach. First of all, it was an amazing presentation, and I saw the Astaria project, and it's very, very complex and very interesting, and it's using a lot of moving parts. So it's mind blowing the work that you have done. On the last Seaport problem, just to understand.
Yeah, I have a question. I mean, taking a step back, what do you think?
I think he was just in the middle of asking a question.
Sorry, who?
I was talking. Yeah.
Okay, Strami, go on.
Yeah, sorry. And the problem was that whatever amount of ETH that was sent back to the clearinghouse, it was like the full amount of the loan was being paid back. So they wasn't checking that the amount will match the amount that should have been sent to the clearinghouse to clear the borrow.
Yeah, that's exactly right. The challenge is that they couldn't just check the amount because they didn't know how much it would sell for. So the way these auctions worked is that they started at some floor and then they would lower down to guarantee that it got sold at some point. And so they couldn't check the amount, but they needed, I think they could have realistically used the same system, but done a few other checks around making sure that the collateral had actually moved to the buyer. But I guess for some reason, I'm not sure why that didn't work for them, but they ended up going to this other system that would trigger it kind of as a part of the transfers that seemed to work better for them.
Just out of curiosity, what would happen if no one would have liquidate that?
Yeah, that was handled. So there was a way, I can't remember the exact details, but a way for the liquidator to call a function that would basically verify that the Seaport auction was over, and then would just allow them to withdraw the NFT for free. Hari, did you have something you were asking?
Yeah, so taking a step back, what do you think the Astaria team should have done to prevent a lot of these bugs? What did you see in terms of like engineering that they missed?
Yeah, so I guess one piece of it is that it is just like a complex system, right? Like there's not a way that's like, oh, you obviously could have made this very simple. But I think it was clear that the product had evolved a lot and had more and more added to it and wasn't kind of rebuilt or rethought from first principles. And so what you ended up with were these code paths where you could tell there was one default path, right? Like taking a lien was like the default path. But then they added the logic for one vault to buy out another vault's lien. And you could tell that was kind of tacked on after. So like there were a bunch of small issues around, for example, they're trying to limit the number of loans that were taken at 5. But when you did the buyout process, it wasn't counting the fact that you were getting rid of one. So there are all these issues that you could tell came from adding features like one by one, it seemed like over a long period of time. And so my recommendation, I think it would have been an advantage to them if they had started, if once they felt confident in the features, they had gone back and said like, what's every code path and what's every shared piece of logic, and let's make sure that the functionality we need is encoded in the shared piece of logic in a way that makes a lot of sense and actually encompasses everything that's needed, rather than having these separate code paths that hopefully touch on all the pieces they need. But especially with state coming from outside the system, you need to make sure every validation is like rock solid. And so I think it's tricky for them to juggle one by one, trying to make sure everything's validated while having so much to validate.
Looking at this code, I feel what you're saying. So I really can picture that they thought that it was not enough features and they had to add more and more, but the foundation were not so strong. So the main question, when you arrive at this point, do you think that they were lacking, other than the architectural changes and rethinking about all of that, do you think that they were lacking a good amount of tests? Because I see that it's very complex. There are a lot of chain parts, and there are also a lot of third-party parts involved. And I see that there is a pain writing a lot of comprehensive tests to make everything works with those tests. So do you think that they were lacking tests, and do you was it easy for you to create POCs with their code base to reproduce those?
Yeah, this is a great question. It's something I've shared with them since this, that I think it's a weird mix. They did all the hard parts of the testing. Like this is a very difficult code base to get tests set up, where they need the encoding and the hashing and the signing off chain and examples and all of that. And they did all of that, but then I don't think they added nearly enough like thoroughness of the edge cases that they were testing. So I think that's something they're working on now. But for the POCs, it made it easy for us because they had done all the testing infrastructure of being able to pull a fake loan and organize all of that. So like they did all the hard part that made our job easier, but I think they could have done and are probably doing now a lot more thorough testing to make sure that it's actually covering everything.
If there are no more questions, then props to you, Zach. Thank you very much for coming and for doing this seminar. We will be releasing it as soon as possible. And thank you everyone else for tuning in. So with that said, I wish everyone a great day.
Thanks, guys.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye.